Hey, everybody. Welcome to Sweater Weather, a podcast about Canadian arts and culture. I'm your host, Aaron Giovannone. Today, we're talking to Leah Cameron. She's a writer and director living in Toronto. She wrote for the television drama Coroner on CBC. And importantly for our discussion today, she's the creator, director, co-writer, and showrunner of The Communist's Daughter, a comedy series loosely based on her left-wing family in Toronto in 1989. It's streaming on CBC Gem for free if you're in Canada. And here's a clip from that.
I hereby put a motion on the floor to get cable TV.
Don't be ridiculous, Boris. Motion denied.
We are communists, yes, but small c.
I don't give a shit.
Communist is considered a bad word in these parts.
Kind of like feminist?
Well, not that bad, but yes.
Are you sure you want to wear that on your first day? High school is a test. I'm not caving.
I've decided to throw my hat in the ring and run in the upcoming election.
You're the guy that was permanently banned from Eaton's for handing out those pamphlets for workers' rights.
That ban was lifted years ago.
Who doesn't own a TV? That's like insane, yo. My cousin's doing, they live in rural Iran.
I hereby put a motion on the floor to get in television. All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Who wants to come silk screen sites for my upcoming campaign?
Is that your dad?
No.
There's no way I'm getting in that thing.
So are we gonna walk?
Yeah, we're gonna be late.
So I'm very excited to talk to Leah today, but we have a bit of business to take care of first. Sweater Weather is very proud to be part of the Harbinger Media Network, broadcasting from the world to come. Check out their lineup of great left-wing shows at harbingermedianetwork.com. And please support Sweater Weather by liking, sharing, retweeting, wherever you find us on social media. And if you can afford it, do consider making a donation to the show on Patreon or PayPal to help us keep going and growing. You'll find those links in the show notes and on our show website, sweaterweatherpod.com. All right, let's get to our interview with Leah Cameron talking about The Communist's Daughter. Thank you, Leah, for being here.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Could you tell us what your new series, The Communist's Daughter, is about?
Yeah. So my series, The Communist's Daughter, is a comedy, 8 12-minute episode comedy on CBC Gem that is set in Toronto in 1989. And it is very loosely based on my childhood. It's about a teenage girl whose parents are devout communists of the charming Canadian variety. And it's about her entering a new high school in a right-wing neighborhood at the height of the consumerist Reagan 80s and how she struggles between sort of upholding her family's values and wanting to fit in. And then when her dad decides to run for election, it makes all of that even more awkward because he runs a very public and embarrassing election campaign.
Besides being really funny, I find the show's unique because of how it's normalizing communism as part of a respectable Canadian past. And I haven't really seen that in Canadian pop culture before. So as you said, it's loosely autobiographical, the show. I'm interested to know how communist was your family or your father? What kind of books were on the bookshelf? And was it difficult to talk about politics with other people given the time?
Well, it's interesting because to make a show work, you've got to sort of take reality and then simplify things. So in reality, I would say my father, like a lot of us, his politics kind of changed over his lifetime. So he, in the 80s, he went through a very, what I would say is communist phase. And I'd say toward the end of his life, we would consider him more of a democratic socialist. And so my mom was definitely left leaning, but it was definitely my father with the idealistic sort of communist and socialist viewpoints. And I smile when I say that because it always seems to be the dads. There's so many women who have written me and who are my dad was exactly like this. Whereas I feel like the mom is a little bit okay, the kids have to fit in. So I guess in our house growing up, we did talk about politics a lot, which I think is much more common now. But I think the 80s and 90s were a phase when people were less politically engaged than they are now. So I definitely think it was more rare, especially in my neighborhood, and especially of being of my background. Like, I'm definitely a WASPy Canadian. I feel like at that time it was considered very impolite to talk politics. And so it was definitely awkward. Like, my dad loved to strike up political debates and conversations at family gatherings where like our relatives didn't necessarily have the same political viewpoints. So that was definitely a thing. And I think more than anything, it just gave me a different perspective than like a lot of my peers. It's an exaggeration. It's not that I had trouble like fitting in at high school or anything, I don't think. But, you know, I remember like debating with my English teacher that like we read Animal Farm, and he insisted that like, you know, all revolutions are doomed to fail. And then I would be like, well, what about Cuba? And what about Haiti? And like, what about, you know, the American Revolution? Anyway, so, and I still remember like people bringing in pieces of the Berlin Wall and me being really skeptical in grade 4.
You were like, that's not really the Berlin Wall. Or
No.
It was just like, oh, is this so great? Really?
Well, it was more, which seems crazy looking back on it, because I think it was a great thing. But I guess my dad was skeptical of like this sort of thing that America made of it, or I don't know. But
fair enough.
Yeah. So I definitely had a different perspective. And in some ways, I like to say to people that I feel like my dad was like this Bernie Sanders out of time. And he was actually a high school teacher, and his students like loved him because he would teach the real version of American history and get students to like really, you know, question certain narratives they'd been taught. And so he's kind of a rebel. And so like a lot of my friends loved him. But then when I would say to people he was a communist, you could tell like they couldn't compute that, because they would just think like, okay, like Drago and Rocky IV, like they didn't. And so I always found there's a lot of comedy in that my dad was really a humanist and an idealist who believed that everybody should be treated fairly and equally. But then when you said that word, it's sort of like when you said the word feminist back in the day, people like had these associations of what that you know, of what that meant. Yeah. And then in terms of like books on our bookshelf, like my dad read a lot of Chomsky. Fidel's My Life was on his bookshelf, Soviet Economy, a lot of books about class warfare. He'd studied economics, so really from like a moral perspective of like economic justice. Yeah, what else? I guess, yeah, the Motorcycle Diaries. And then I think I mentioned also like Norman Bethune was a huge hero of my father's.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Very cool guy.
Mm-hmm.
I think I saw an earlier version of The Communist's Daughter on YouTube. What has been the production history of the show? How did it end up in its current form on CBC Gem?
Yeah, oh my gosh. So it was such a journey to get this show made. My producer, Natalie Novak, and I shot the teaser. Gosh, I feel like it was like over 3 years ago now. But the long and short of the show, or the long and short of the production history, I'd say was, I guess in 2018, I got into a program called Women in the Director's Chair with like 8 other women from across the country, where we, the goal of which is to develop your own original material. And so in that program, I'd written The Communist's Daughter as a half-hour script before for television. But in that program, I applied to make it into a web series. And so I did some development work there where like I workshopped scenes I'd written with actors. They brought in amazing actors and we got to workshop with them. And then from there, I decided I wanted to go and get funding for the series, because there is quite a bit of digital series funding available in Canada, which is great. It's very competitive though. So that's when I brought my producer, Natalie Novak, on board, and we shot a teaser in the dead of winter, like 3 years ago, and then used that in this pitch package we created to apply for this fund called the Independent Production Fund. And part of obtaining that funding is proving there's an audience for it. So I was marketing that teaser online quite a bit, and I had a theory that like fellow lefties would really like it, or people from former like Soviet bloc countries who just thought it was preposterous would like it too. Yeah, so I kind of developed a bit of an audience for it then. And then we applied for some other funding bodies, went to Just for Laughs in Montreal to pitch it in a pitch competition, which we won, again with that teaser. And then I think from there, we brought Locomotion Pictures on board as our exec producers, and they were able to kind of close the financing. And that was like, I think a year and a half to get that funding. And we weren't sure if we were going to get the last piece. So I also did a Kickstarter campaign. So there's tons of amazing people who helped support our Kickstarter as well. So that was sort of the journey to get it made. And then once we had the funding in place, we put together a writing room of like 6 writers, which is really cool. And one of them is my friend Juanita Storms, who grew up in a very communist household in the bush in BC, like even more so than mine. So she was a great person to have in the room. And she was the one who came up with the idea. In the show, Dunyasha auditions for Little Orphan Andy, which is supposed to be Little Orphan Annie.
Very funny.
Yeah, because Juanita ended up being an actress later in life, but when she was in high school, she wanted to audition for Little Orphan Annie, and her dad was like, absolutely not. That's like the most capitalist play ever. Like, just because like the orphan, like this billionaire helps one orphan, I'm supposed to like him. Anyway, so she told us this funny story. Anyway, so we put this writing room together of 6 of us over like 3 days, and we kind of figured out the broad strokes of the season. Or I'd gone in with the broad strokes, but then we sort of like refined that a bit as a group. And then people went away and wrote their episodes, and then I sort of rewrote those. Yeah, that was sort of the process. And then, you get those scripts into shape and then shoot the thing. So
it's a long process. I mean, hearing it, narrated that way, it's like, oh yeah, getting the funding is like a huge process. And then having a collaborative, creative production team is like, this is, I mean, I have to say all that effort and time shows, because the show looks really good. I mean,
Thanks.
Amazing costumes. It just has that kind of like 80s nostalgia look, like down really well. So the time and money definitely, I think they paid off for sure.
Yeah, and like a lot of love. My friend Emma Doyle was the head costume designer, and she worked on the teaser with me. And I just felt like she got the sense of humor and she got the era really well. And her friend Liza Kelly was part of the costume teams for the show. So they did a kick-ass job. And then my cinematographer, Connor Fisher, and I talked about giving the show an 80s look, but also a Soviet look. So I wanted the McDougald home to be desaturated and kind of like feel a little bit like it's stuck behind the Iron Curtain and a little bit blah, just because Dunyasha doesn't feel it's exciting compared to the outside world. And Freaks and Geeks was also like a reference there, because in Freaks and Geeks, they purposely made the light feel very gray and Michigan kind of. So I wanted that feeling inside the house. And then we wanted this high school to be like bright colors and like to represent this like consumerist world that is tempting her.
So, even though there's a lot of overtly political stuff happening in the show, including in an election, right? I mean, the show, I find it doesn't get like subsumed by its politics so that it, becomes like preachy or propagandistic, which is like a danger, I think, whenever you're doing something cultural involving politics. Especially these days. So I think instead, like what I find anyway in the show, is that you've made the politics the subject of the comedy, if that makes sense. So I'm just wondering if you have a certain approach to treating politics in your show, and if you took inspiration from other kinds of political comedy.
Yeah, well, I definitely think that I'm able to write about politics in a comedic way because I grew up around it. So I don't like, I'm able to understand that people have different points of view and find some like humor in that, and in the ridiculous like jockeying that happens in real elections. And like, I mean, my dad would laugh at it too. Like he'd be like, oh, that person just is voting for me because like she likes my hair, or like there's just ridiculous stuff that happens in any election. But yeah, in terms of, I wanted it to be a show. I really, really wanted it to be a show that was about a family first and about their friends and neighbors first. And so I think for that to be successful and everybody to feel like it's like I'm making comedy at the end of the day, I don't want to make something that's propagandistic or didactic. And so I think for me, it was really important to center it in the family and these, to make them real human people, but also even their adversaries, like feel like, you know, real people. Yeah, well, I think it was really key to me to make it a comedy first and foremost. Like my producer, Natalie Novak, she's Polish and her parents came to Canada in 1989, the year the wall came down. You know, so it was really important for me to make a show where the comedy was sort of about a charming, idealistic Canadian family that is like, I don't like to use the word naive, but like they're idealists. And so I wanted some of the comedy to come from that it's not that they're like people who would be pro-regime of any kind, you know? So I wanted a lot of the comedy to come from them being charming people. And then I'd also say that because, I mean, I had never seen a show about a family of leftists. And so I thought that that would be like an exciting thing to do. Like we've all seen these family fish out of water comedies like Fresh Off the Boat or the Goldbergs. But I wanted to do one where the thing that separated them was like their political viewpoint and beliefs. So I thought that was really fun. And then I thought what I could do is make, like they're still the protagonists. So we're still going to root for them because really they just care about sharing. So we're going to root for them because they're the protagonists without ever like getting into anything that's too like, you should think this or you should think that. I just thought that we could, there's certain things I think we can agree. Most people can probably agree with that socialism has right in terms of like trying to treat people fairly and, you know, because I think we can see a lot of the ills of Reagan era capitalism that have come home to roost. And like, it is funny if you look at them, like some of these ridiculous beliefs that, oh yeah, if you just give tax cuts to the rich, like everybody's going to benefit. It's like, whoever believes, like, why did anyone ever believe that? You know,
apparently it seemed like a good idea at the time.
Yeah. And I think like hindsight, like I think we can now look at that in an era where Bernie is like popular and the word socialism is no longer a bad word. We can look back on that and kind of, and laugh, I hope.
Definitely.
Yeah. I'd say in terms of influences, Parks and Rec would be a show I would look at because I think what that show does really effectively is like, it's about municipal politics. So you can like look at issues that seem sort of less important, but then because Leslie Knope thinks that she's Hillary Clinton and takes them really seriously, that's where the comedy comes from, right? And in that show, you know, I forget her boss's name with the mustache. Like, you know, he's a Republican because he's all into guns and like, you know, works for government but doesn't believe in government. And they get jokes out of that, but they don't actually like label him as being Republican. Anyway, so I feel like that's a show that successfully kind of has types that sort of have one political belief or another, but the comedy comes out of like just their sort of struggles and to achieve these small goals, right? Which I think is funny to watch. So
absolutely, that's great. I hadn't thought of that those characters in Parks and Rec in that way, but that's so true. So you'll have to forgive this long-winded question here, but you know, I was thinking, and maybe we've been talking about it and around it so far too. I think, you know, comedy and community, I think they're often intimately linked, and I feel like that's true in your series too. You know, firstly, there's like a great ensemble, like of everyone in the family, in the friend group. And I don't know if you agree, but like to me, that seems kind of more important to comedy than it does to drama, which sometimes can lean more heavily on just one protagonist. But I mean, that's neither here nor there. But I do think, you know, comedy, you know, often reaffirms community by promising continuity, you know, through the classic happy ending that has, you know, romance or marriage or even birth. And, you know, another way this kind of works too is like laughing is a communal experience, you know, ideally done out loud with other people, which is maybe an experience we've not enjoyed lately during the pandemic. But, you know, I think it was the philosopher Hobbes who described laughter rather darkly as a mode of social control, where the community sets its boundaries by laughing together at something that it mocks or that it shuns. And that's pretty harsh. And I guess that's Hobbes. And it's certainly not the whole story of what comedy is, but, there is something to this idea, I think, that laughter helps construct insiders and outsiders, maybe denying certain values and, affirming others. So, is it fair to say that the communist's daughter affirms a certain kind of community, or that it says something about communal life?
Yeah, it's like there's a lot in that question. Well, I think that I believe that good comedy is made through collaboration and through, like, going back to what you were saying about an ensemble cast. I strongly believe that comedy you need a certain alchemy between the actors and your creative team for it to, like, really spark. And I genuinely think, like, a lot of the funniest stuff out there is really a bunch of friends who got together and formed an improv troupe and made stuff together. If you look at, like, SCTV, I think that's definitely the case. If you look at, like, Kids in the Hall, like, it's people who get one another making comedy together. And I think that alchemy is, like, very funny. And I think, like, I have a little bit of improv training from Second City, and that's very much a mentality of, like, if everybody tries to make everyone else look good, the whole thing gets better. It's not about every person out for themselves, right? Which is maybe more stand-up. But I feel like improv is very much of that spirit. And so that sort of collaborative approach to creating comedy really excites me. And for that reason, it's like, I always, we had a finalized script when we went to shoot, but I knew that I was working with a lot of really great actors who would be able to bring moments of improv to the table too. So there's a lot of stuff in there that is, like, improv lines of dialogue that I ended up keeping from Jessica Holmes, Nima Nazari, like Aaron Poole, like all our Sophia Benzaf, like all our great cast. So I think that there's that communal aspect to making comedy. I'm just, like, trying to think about this idea of sort of how comedy condones some things and not others. It's a good question. I suppose that's why what we find funny is always changing, right? Like, it's really interesting that, a lot of comics look back on jokes they made 10 years ago that they admit now we're punching down or we're not funny. I don't think it's, like, ever good to punch down at people personally, but it's really interesting, I think, of, like, how our what we find funny as a society is always changing. And I never found Andrew Dice Clay funny, but, like, I feel like most people would now agree, maybe, or, you watch Eddie Murphy Raw now, it's like, oh, Jesus, like, some of that stuff does not age well. And I think for good reason, because people are saying, no, it's not okay to make jokes about certain members of the population. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Community is sort of, its values are evolving and they're changing, and you can see that in how certain comedy is accepted or not, or how you look back at it later. It's true.
Well, and I also would add that I think when you're doing a show that's set in another era, it's kind of a great thing, because what it allows is for you to talk about the mores of today, but it allows you to set them in the past so that you can, like, laugh at them, and it doesn't feel like as it gives people some distance, I think. So it doesn't feel like you're attacking anyone in the present, but really you're talking about our values now and being like, look at this. Like, look how in the 80s, like, people thought trickle down economics was a great thing, right? And it's just easier to laugh at that with that distance. Like, if you watch, I actually watched, like, the 1980s, the version of Annie that came out in the 80s, the musical. And it's so funny. There's a song about tax cuts for the rich, like a very joyous song. And that movie which I think now we can look at and like laugh, but I'm sure a lot of people just like ate that up at the time, right?
I haven't seen that 80s Little Orphan Annie in a while, so I'd forgotten about that.
It is like all red, white, and blue. Like the production side is like all red, white, and blue. And then, yeah, there's like songs. There is a musical number about tax cuts for the rich. Pretty funny.
What would you say about the bad guy in The Communist's Daughter?
Yeah, so a comedian named Chris Locke plays the master antagonist, Rod Bigman, in our show. And the idea is he's like a capitalist who like flips houses because it's the 80s. So he's making his money in real estate. He's like I think of him as like a mini hoser Trump. Yeah, so I wanted to have him as a foil for the family and their sort of idealistic lefty beliefs. I wanted to have someone who was a foil for that and to make him a bit ridiculous and exaggerated, just in the same way that some of the father's beliefs are slightly exaggerated and silly, just so that there could be a comedic sort of. I wanted the antagonist to be very clearly an antagonist, but in a bit of an absurd way, so we could just like laugh at him and not take him too seriously, without feeling like I'm insulting real people. If that makes sense.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Although, I mean, plenty of people are making their money off of real estate these days too, I guess. One of the few ways to get rich, I think, still. But
true.
Yeah. He's a great, it's a great character, and he works wonderfully as a foil too.
Thanks.
Are you, I mean, we don't have to include any of this either. We can cut this part out. I don't know if this is, like, is there going to be a second season? Maybe you don't know yet, or?
I don't know yet. I mean, I'd love for there to be a second season. I would say if you want one, get your viewers to like comment on CBC Gem's site or on our Facebook page or Instagram and let us know. Because the more that we can show that there's the demand for it, then I think the more success we would have at getting funding. But yeah, I definitely would love to do a season 2. I have some ideas for what that would be, which I won't share. But and there have been a lot of people who have asked us if we're doing a season 2. So,
well, you've left it cleverly open as a possibility. So it's a good move.
All I'll say is that in my mind, the dad is the kind of person who, if he loses in one riding, will just move the family to another riding, and he will try to win again there.
Oh wow, that's great! I love that idea. Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Leah, for talking with me today.
Yeah, you're welcome. Oh, can I just show you one thing? So
please do.
These are from our Kickstarter campaign. So we have T-shirts. These "I Love Lada" T-shirts, and then I have other ones that have. Karl
Did you
Marx
make those to promote the show?
Yeah, because people who gave to our Kickstarter campaign, this was one of the T-shirts we were offering, and my best friend from childhood designed them. But a lot of people who love Ladas are like really into them. We have like a whole group of people on Facebook who like fix up old Ladas. Who are
There's
like
a Lada fan group. That's so neat. I mean, I only remember seeing like 1 or 2 Ladas in my entire childhood, and always being like, "Oh, what is that? It's a weird, like very different looking car or whatever." But it looks like it's like an SUV kind of ahead of its time in a way too.
Well, it's funny because like it's hard to. Like, it was very embarrassing when we had one because we drove this exact car when we were kids.
Was it yellow? It was yellow
no,
too?
No, okay. It was blue. It was blue like the one in the show.
Okay.
But it was really loud and like smelly, and it wouldn't go over like 90K on the highway. It was also cheap. My dad was also Scottish Canadian and very cheap. So I think that's part of the reason why he liked Ladas. Right. But like it was always breaking down on set, the one we had. And then we realized you could just push it. It like weighed as much as a shopping cart. You could just like push it.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Yeah, so we made these up, and then the other thing which I thought maybe your viewers would like is we had these T-shirts that I'm getting made up that say "Sharing is Caring" with Karl Marx on them.
Oh, nice. Yeah, I mean, I think he'd get behind that idea.
I think so. Thank you,
Thank you, Leah, for talking with me today.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me on your show.